Remember this table? It's one of the nicest things I've ever built, and unfortunately it's on its way back to my shop because there was one fatal flaw with the design. The clients had mentioned that they saw some weird cracking happening around the brass inlay, and I knew that it was because the finish was pulling itself apart since the table was contracting. And in this video, I'm gonna fix each breadboard end, but first I re-edited all of the original build videos so that we can see how this table was built. Then at the end, I'll share exactly how I repair this table and make sure that it never returns to the shop again. To build this table, we're gonna be using some thick walnut. And by thick, I mean really thick, like 10-quarter and 12-quarter walnut. And the first step is finding those perfect boards for the tabletop, since the top is one of the most important pieces of a table. The customers wanted it to be modeled after the Hellman & Chang James dining table. So this isn't my design, but the customers wanted some specific details changed, like a solid wood top and a high gloss finish, since the Hellman & Chang model is actually a veneered top, which I totally understand why they do because there are going to be brass inlays and we'll get into that in the future. But for now, let's just focus on the walnut top. Since these are just rough sawn boards, we need to get them milled up so that we can actually see what we're working with. And Cody's really feeling the pain of shoving one of these giant things through the joiner, since I have the job of ripping them on the table saw. So you're probably thinking, why aren't you guys helping each other? And well, of course, because we're not smart enough. We haven't figured that out yet. Plus, I enjoy watching Cody struggle his way through the joiner. But I guess enough of that, because these things are just too darn big to handle with one person. And I don't realize it until the end of this cut, but I'm cutting way too much off this board because I forgot to reset the fence. And luckily this didn't impact the width of our table because each one of these boards costs a lot of money. So now we're cutting them to rough length before we mill the faces, which by now we have a pretty good groove where the leading person ends up being the back person, and then this keeps revolving over and over. And of course, you could spend a lot of time doing this with a hand plane as well. Or most lumber yards can mill the boards for you for an added charge if you don't want to send these things through a lunchbox planer. The walnut top will have a brass inlay along the breadboard end, but more importantly, there's a tenon that needs to be cut along the table side of the joint, and it's going to save us some time later if we cut away some of that material now on each board. So with a quick test cut to confirm the correct depth, we can start hogging away material by putting the board on a sled and using the dado stack to cut the tenons. You absolutely don't have to do this step. I just figured at the time that it was a good idea to get rid of this material, but you could just rely on the router later. I've used this technique in the construction field before, where I put a 2x4 on two of the roller stands that I have, and using that as a sled for the other side of the board, and it works pretty darn well. Even better than having someone hold the other side, because then it eliminates the possibility of human error. Now you can see the long tabletop tenon come to shape. And don't forget to mark these because we want to keep them in order. These do need one last pass on the joiner with the inside-outside method because I can still fit a feeler gauge in some of the joints. So this pass is really light in making sure that that surface is perfect, because now I literally can't even find the joint to put the feeler gauge in. The glue up is going to be split up into several parts, 2 boards on the right side, 2 boards on the left side, and 1 board in the middle left alone. The reason we're doing it this way is so that we can send the 2 separate glue ups through the planer after they're dry. And this will result in a much flatter tabletop, serving us very well since this thing will be a high gloss finish. But you'll see in future clips that I actually end up taking a hand plane to the tabletop to flatten it, so you could just glue up the whole table as is right now, as long as you're at the correct final thickness that you want. These boards are milled a little bit thicker than the final thickness because they're going to be sent back through the planer anyways. Another reason why I like doing these tops in multiple glue ups is the fresher the glue is, the easier it squeezes out and the better your joints will look. And the best joint out there is a joint you can't see at all. And speaking of good joints, this joint on bottom had a live edge exposed, so I'm going to fill it with some black epoxy since the final table will actually be stained black. A card scraper helps clean up the rest of the glue squeeze out before we send these things through the planer. Which, by the way, it's just a preference, but I really don't like how walnut looks on the sapwood side, so I always try to face that side down. The top side shown here looks so much better, and the joints came out amazing. And don't forget to mill that lonesome board down to final thickness too, because these things are about to be attached, but not without jointing them first. Yep, we're going to be sending these huge things through the joiner. And since we learned our lesson and apparently 2 people are better than 1, it actually wasn't that bad. And this thing is looking pretty freaking awesome. For this final glue up, I really prefer to use dominoes since we're not going to be able to send this thing through the planer again, and we want everything to be perfectly level. For this glue up, it's important that we go as fast and efficient as possible because again, the faster we glue it up, the better the joints will look in the end. And luckily everything went smoothly because we're professionals and I could only hope we could pull off a 2-joint glue up, but that doesn't stop us from being proud. With clamping calls on the ends and a quick check of the middle, this thing's flat. And I'm exhausted. Now it's time to cut the long edges of the table straight and parallel to one another. If they aren't parallel, then the square cut I'm going to do next won't actually be square. And our final width is 48 inches. Now I can use a track with a track square to cut the tenons nice and straight. This will come in handy for the next step. This giant bit by Amana is going to be doing the final cutting of the tenons. The guide for the router is actually the board that will eventually be the breadboard end. A guide block positions it a perfect distance away from the end of the tenon, and that's why the tenon needs to be cut square and straight. So the guide board can be clamped down and an end block can also be clamped to reduce tear out. I only need to do 1 depth of pass since we pre-cut the tenons earlier on, but if you didn't pre-cut the tenons, I strongly suggest that you do several passes of different depths. And since we planned it so that this bit doesn't have much to cut, the cut is perfect and leaves a glass smooth finish. Just make sure whatever straight guide you're using is dead straight. Now with the board repositioned, we can cut the second pass on the outer edge of the tenon. And to make sure that the surface is perfectly even, a hard sanding block sands everything smooth. We're just making sure that whatever sanding we do is even across the whole tenon. Now the second tenon can be cut just like the first, and luckily there were no lessons to be learned, so we did it the exact same way. And yes, Cody got a little dirty. Another thing I haven't mentioned is how tight your board is against the tabletop, because this will impact how straight the tenon is. Let's say hypothetically, your tabletop is really cupped, but your board is straight. When you run your router across it, your tenon will be perfectly straight, but your tabletop will be left cupped. We don't want that. We actually want the tenon to follow the natural variation of the tabletop. That way, when the breadboard end goes on, it actually flattens everything. Now the other side can be cut, but we need to make sure that it gets cut perfectly square to the last cut. Before this last cut though, I actually noticed that the tabletop is a little bit cupped, so I just add a shim in the middle and that raises that center. The full thickness of the top is 2 inches, and each shoulder gets cut down to 5/8, leaving the tenon at 3/4. This follows the 1/3 rule when you're dealing with tenons. This usually offers the most strength for the joint. And a final check confirms that they're perfectly square to one another. Now it's time to work on the breadboard ends, and trust me, you're probably not going to like how I cut the mortises. But before we get to that, I want to do a test cut to check the fit, then I can cut the breadboard ends to length. And a quick run on the joiner since these have been sitting out for about a week. I cut mine even with the sides because it's summer and the top will shrink in the winter. Now this is where things get a little bit dicey because I'm actually doing a plunge cut on a dado stack, pressing a lot of force against a stop block so that the board doesn't go flying. This process was definitely a two-man job, and I honestly don't recommend it for your safety, but for us and our experience, we were comfortable with it. Now you can see the operation. Cody will unclamp the stop block as soon as I do the plunge, then he will quickly scurry around to the other side so that he can help me put force against the fence. Keep in mind this is also a saw stop, thankfully. But we're not done yet because a second pass has to be made so that the mortise is a full 2 inches deep. And I'm sure this process could be done on a router table, but I feel like it would also be pretty unsafe. But all that unsafe shenanigans is worth it because look at that fit. Since the mortise in the breadboard end doesn't go all the way to the edge, neither can the tenon on the table, so it has to get cut to the same radius as the blade that we used. I'm taking into account expansion of the top, so the tenon gets cut back an extra 1/4 inch in case the table ever gets shipped to somewhere humid like Florida. Upon first tests of this tenon, it is of course a little bit too tight, but that's what we want. Because now we can take those same hard sanding blocks and sand the tenon down so that it is nothing short of a perfect fit. And don't get me wrong, this is actually quite the process. This probably took an hour and a half just to fit this one tenon. But it's worth all of that time because we really need this joint to be as good as it possibly could be. And over time, we get closer and closer to that exact fit we need. And when you do this, you'll probably see just how satisfying this process is. And something that I didn't mention before is that the breadboards are left a little bit thicker than the top, that way they can get hand planed down later. And we need that buffer for this exact reason. And now it's time to commit and hammer the thing home. The breadboard is extra wide so that I can cut off the hammer marks later. My low-angle jack plane is one of my favorites if I'm doing things like this because I know it won't cause tear out. I still feel like I have a lot of control, it cuts really well, and I know I'm not going to create big gashes in this expensive walnut top. This is one of those times in woodworking that you just want to put on some music and take your time and do a really, really good job. I'm tailoring everything, including the shoulders, so that everything fits absolutely perfectly, as if I haven't already told you that. Now we can start on the other side. On this one, I'm choosing to use my Stanley No. 5 to take off the bulk of the material first, then I'll refine with the low-angle jack plane later, followed by a flat sanding with 80 grit. I'm checking this top meticulously for flatness because this high gloss finish will show absolutely everything. And marking the high spots will make it easy for me to know where to hand plane later. I'm just using extremely light cuts, that way I don't go too far with it. And I have to admit, I never thought there would come a day that I would actually hand plane a tabletop that I would later put a high gloss finish on. I just never thought I would have enough experience to pull something like that off. But I guess practice does make perfect, and patience really is a virtue. I'm making sure to check the top as I go, both across the width and across the length. Then when my OCD gives me the go-ahead, I can sand the whole thing with 80 grit to get rid of any planer marks. Because in case I haven't mentioned it before, this thing needs to be perfectly flat. And you might have asked yourself, how in the world does he get the breadboard ends back off? And honestly, it took me a minute, but clamping 2 sanding blocks to the board and hammering it back off actually works great. The sanding blocks protect the board from being damaged because if the clamp was just directly clamped to the board, then the wood would probably get bruised. And unfortunately, I'm about to really screw up. Right now, I'm routing a groove down the entire width of the tabletop for a brass inlay, and I don't know if you can see the problem with this, but I'm about to have a pretty sad realization.
You know what I just realized?
No, Corey, what did you just realize?
I can't do the inlay on the table side because that has to expand and contract. So it has to be on the breadboard end. So I'm gonna have to basically cut the tenon further.
So I guess it's not the end of the world because I could just cut the tenon back further, and luckily I left extra width to the breadboard ends, so there was actually no change to the overall length of the table, since the customers do want a 120-inch table, not 119 3/4. But anyways, now the grooves can be routed into the breadboard ends since expansion won't cause problems there. I'm just making sure to use blocks so that I don't get tear out. And in case you're lost, there will eventually be a brass inlay across the top and the side, but not on the bottom because that would be wasted material and labor. Now Cody can give the top an 80 grit sanding while I whack the ends back on. Only that the underside hasn't been leveled, and I wanted to give Cody a chance to do it himself. And I'm glad I did because Cody did an amazing job, and that means you could too. Especially since this is his first time picking up a hand plane and he's planing a very expensive table. And I am having him check flatness probably more often than he needs to, but I just want to really make sure that he doesn't go too far in one area. And I really almost can't believe it. I'll say it again, he did an amazing job. He actually pulled off every step exactly like I would do it or a professional would do it. And by the time he finishes the second side, he's a freaking pro. Who hired this guy? There will be brass on the table as well as plated on the legs. Those accents will be cut from a $1,000 sheet of 16th inch brass, and until today I had no clue how I was even going to cut this thing. But luckily brass is a non-ferrous metal, meaning it doesn't have iron content, which unimportantly means that it's not magnetic, but more importantly it means I can cut it with woodworking tools. And I don't know about you, but I don't think I'm supposed to be seeing smoke. But let's just say maybe the mean commenters from last video are right. Maybe I'm just idiotic. Or a freaking genius. Because now we have a more manageable sized piece that we can clean up the ends on and run this thing through a job site table saw. The reason why we're using this small saw is because we don't want to build up a bunch of brass shavings inside of the main saw that we have, which is a saw stop. And I'm really starting to regret not having a blade guard for this saw because these brass shavings are a firing squad of sharp metal across my arms and face. So maybe the commenters are right. Maybe I'm just a big dummy because all I did was change into a long sleeve shirt and continue the process. Let's be honest, this brass has to get cut one way or another. And what better way to pour my blood, sweat, and tears into the project than pouring my blood, sweat, and tears onto the project? But to keep you in the loop of what's actually happening here, right now I'm cutting the panels that will eventually be on the leg assembly. And by cutting the larger pieces now, I'm left with smaller pieces that I can rip into the correct size of the smaller inlays. But those small pieces will likely get sucked right into the saw, so I need a zero clearance insert. And a quick piece of plywood clamped to the table does the trick. So now that everything fits, it's time to cut the strips. Which isn't as bad as I thought it was going to be, but I am realizing I should probably order a face shield. But thankfully that process is done and they fit perfectly. I definitely don't want to have to do any of that cutting again. So why in the heck did I do this?
Oh, shit.
But no way, Jose, I am not cutting that again. So I'm going to hammer this thing back in place and it will be perfectly fine. Especially since I cut it a little extra long so that I could square it up on the edge sander. I'm choosing to have the side overlap the top. And here's why. If I do a simple butt joint, then the chamfer that I eventually add will actually hide that joint. And like I said in the last video, the best joint out there is one that you can't see at all. So to cut these small end pieces, I'm using a literal push block and my bandsaw. But before I start the glue up, I don't want a whole bunch of epoxy all over this breadboard end because it would be a mess to clean up. So masking tape will solve that problem. So I'm mixing up an epoxy that I've never used before because it has a little bit more working time than 5-minute epoxy that you'd find at the home center. Although I don't recommend it for this purpose, and you'll have to stick around to see why. I just figured that the 30-minute working time of the epoxy would give me more time to get everything applied and get the inlays installed before it starts kicking off, which is technically true because I clearly have enough time to get all the tape on and everything situated. And although this is a pretty lengthy process, it still only takes about 7 minutes or so. So naturally I figure I have plenty of time. Plenty of time. But by now I'm starting to feel like something is just a little off. The epoxy is starting to thicken up and it's harder to brush on. But that couldn't be, right? It's only been 7 minutes and it's 30-minute epoxy and my shop's only 68 degrees. So it must be in my head and everything will be perfectly fine.
So I know you're a proactive thinker, and you're probably thinking, won't the thickness of that wood expand and contract and break the bond between the brass and the wood? And my answer to that is, it's 2 inches, baby. I like to live life on the edge.
Well, he's saying the board is 2 inches, not his. Well, you know, 2 inches will only have microns of movement, and the epoxy should have enough elasticity to keep its bond, no questions asked. But by now on the second breadboard, I'm moving a lot faster and the epoxy isn't having time to thicken up. But regardless, something just doesn't feel right about this epoxy, so I'm running a quick test so that I can check the adhesion later. And while everything is curing, I'm clamping some cauls to the table to keep it flat since the breadboard ends won't be on for a few days. It's a new day and I'm excited to get this little bundle of joy unwrapped. If you haven't tried inlay work, it's incredibly satisfying and I've even mentioned that before. But luckily the epoxy cured well and let's test this piece. Uh-oh, that came off easier than I expected it to. So that's definitely not making me very confident moving forward. Oh no! And my confidence is not going up. And here's when I really start to question life and if I'm even freaking worthy. Because, uh-oh.
No! 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 No!
Yes, this epoxy says it bonds to metal, but it doesn't. So I don't know whether to say shame on me or shame on them, but either way, I have to test a new epoxy. And yes, I did scuff sand the brass before and it still didn't get adhesion, so now I'm testing the JB Weld 5-minute epoxy.
I'm definitely going to need some time to figure out this one because the solution is going to be crucial. And sometimes I have to learn how to step away for a minute. So the best thing we could do here is just move on.
This is some thick 3-inch walnut, and it needs to be milled to 2.5 inches thick by 5 inches wide. This will serve as an extremely strong, robust structure when it's all said and done. The ends need to be cut to 14.5 degrees, and when jointed together, it will produce the tapered look of the legs. One set will be short and wide, while the other set will be skinny and tall to mimic the legs on the Hellman & Chang James dining table. So the blade needs to be tilted to cut the short and wide set of the legs. Then I can set it on an assembly table to mark the correct height. This dining table is going to be 30 inches tall, minus a 2-inch top, which is 28 inches. And making sure both end legs are exactly the same length is pretty crucial here. So now you can see how everything will be jointed together. And with a quick check, all the measurements match the model that I designed. Now for the tall and skinny set of legs, the crosscut sled actually has to be set to 14.5 degrees. You could also use an accurate miter saw or a track saw. To get the same measurement as the other legs, I can actually use one as the template as long as I line up the backs of both legs. Then I can cut it to the correct length. Just make sure you cut the angles the same direction rather than opposing, because that would be a little silly to make that mistake. On this one, I can just use a stop block to make sure both legs are cut to the same length. And setting everything on top of the other assembly will help guide me for the correct length to cut the base at, since we do want both of these assemblies to be the same length. And this actually proves itself to be a pretty good trick since measuring these things is pretty difficult. The proof is in the pudding. And you might be wondering, how am I going to get these jointed together in the splayed fashion that they're in? And it's actually a lot more simple than you'd think. First, by marking the centers on both of the base pieces. We want the pivot point to be in the center, then we can splay the legs as wide as we want them. So after pre-drilling both pieces, I can just screw them together so that they're one unit. This screws from the bottom side and it will never be seen. I just recommend not breaking the screw. because then you'll be doing the helicopter for an eternity getting that 3.5-inch screw out. So lesson learned, pre-drill your hole big enough. And now a new screw can replace it and the story can unfold. Feast your eyes, for it is incredible. Now easy enough, with the legs splayed to the correct width at the end, I can just use a marking knife to mark both sides, starting off very softly so I don't catch any grain, then gradually pressing harder and harder. Now I can pull everything apart again and expose the cut lines. And I'm thinking the easiest way to cut this is going to be with the track saw. I can control really easily where I cut, how deep I cut, and how many cuts I have, since inevitably there's going to be a lot of cuts to get rid of this waste. And there's no reason to cut all of the wood away because we can just use hand tools to get rid of the rest afterwards. And on the plus side, this next process is pretty satisfying. And after a quick sanding block, this joint is perfectly fine for the next steps. I made the joint slightly tight so that I could just sand the next board to a nice tight fit. Then the pieces can be screwed back together again. And now the other board can be marked. And a marking gauge will mark the correct depth, since this depth is actually more important than the last. The reason for that is because the bottom can be cut to an arbitrary depth, like 3/4, but the top piece has to be cut to a specific depth so that when they're jointed, the bottoms are flush. So the line that I made with the marking gauge is just a guide so that I know if I'm at the correct depth. And I can check and do any adjustments if necessary. Then the same process as last time will work just fine. And if the cards are in your favor, you just might get this one right. Some final finessing will likely be necessary in order for the two pieces to actually slide together. I'm going for a pretty darn tight fit as always, but I'm not going to be using glue this time. So in the future, if the customer's dog happens to chew up a leg, I can actually disassemble everything and repair it. I followed a lot of this same protocol when I was building my Gothic trestle table. So now I can take you in for a closer look. The joint is tight, but it's not too freaking tight, because if it is, it will be very, very hard to get back apart. And even then, we had to wiggle this one pretty good in order to get it to loosen up. And of course, along the process, it gained a few little bruises, so I'm going to use the trick you've all seen on YouTube, the iron trick. This concept is just using superheated steam to re-expand the fibers that were compressed. It may take a few rounds, but it literally works like a charm. Now we can move on to the joinery. I'm choosing to use the domino since this will be plenty strong for this application, but you can choose to use whatever your heart desires. Believe it or not, the stress applied to these joints is going to be pretty minimal because the top of the legs are going to be connected to the table and the bottoms taper in, so they actually get forced together rather than apart. So I recommend using good joinery, but you don't have to go buck wild on this. And you'll just have to take my word for it, but I could literally put this joint together dry without glue and give it to the customer and still sleep at night. Both ends will get dry assembled now, that way we can add profiling to the legs later. And there she is. The second one is joined in the same fashion, although the way the domino seats against the joint is going to be a little bit different. You can see that the front of the domino isn't actually square with the joint, and that's okay, I'm just cutting extra deep. But here's where my goober brain starts screwing with me, because I think I need to put a shim on the other piece in order for the domino to sit square. But this is of course wrong, and the domino actually needed to sit angled. So here I am like a ditz, just trying to get this thing to go together, and gee, I wonder why this thing is not seating right. This is very weird. Oh. But shall not fear, the dominoes are here, and luckily I only did one joint, so I can just smash those puppies in, cut them off, and plane them down. And as long as I make sure that this surface is flat again, then I'll be just fine. Now, to do it the correct way, the plate should actually be sitting angled and no shim should be used. And if I did it correctly this time, the joint should actually go together like a joint is supposed to do. And thankfully, looky there, it actually works if you work it.
Speaking of things that actually work, today's sponsor Incogni literally solves a massive problem that torments every single one of us these days. You know how many scams are out there trying to ruin your life by tricking you through emails, postal mail, or calling and texting your phone, pretending to be someone else? Well, there's a good chance at some point you'll get misled by one of these criminals and lose something greatly valuable to you. They get your information by buying it from data brokers online, so the only way to stop the scammers is actually by stopping the data brokers. So Incogni specializes in removing your information from these brokers' lists to keep your identity safe. As I mentioned in my last video, I signed up for a year plan with them, and they've already sent 242 requests to remove my info and completed 183. And I barely get spam or scam calls now, and it's only been a few months. What can I say? It works, and you can get a really good deal by using my link. So if you want to try it, go to incogni.com/fortress to sign up, and make sure you use code FORTRESS at checkout to get 60% off an annual plan. For real, thanks Incogni for sponsoring this channel, because you truly solved a problem that I was having for a long time.
Before we go gluing everything together, we need to remember to add the tapers to the two different types of legs. The wide legs get 45-degree tapers to help reduce the overall chunkiness and add to some of the pizzazz. While the other legs get a 20-degree cut while standing on edge. Just make sure you cut the right side. Cody has the honors of sanding all the profiles before everything gets glued up, that way it saves labor in the future. Some temporary blocks will be needed in order to clamp this thing up, and I'm just using the blue tape and super glue trick. The blocks were just cut really crudely on the bandsaw. And for the base, I'm just clamping some blocks to the side of it, that way I can work on one joint at a time. If you don't understand what I mean, you'll see here in a second. We're making sure to add glue to the inside of the mortises and the outsides of the dominoes, that way the joint will be as tight as possible. If this was just a tabletop and I was using the dominoes for alignment, then I wouldn't necessarily have to add glue to them. Here in a second, you'll see why these blocks are so handy. I can actually get immense clamping force on just this one joint without relying on using a large clamp and clamping to the other side. And judging by the gobs of glue squeeze out, I think we got plenty of glue in this joint. After both sides are done, the last thing I want to do is check to make sure that the legs are sitting vertical with the base. And luckily there's no skewing happening, so we can move on. And the other side is of course the same process, we just use a square instead of a straight edge to check the verticality of the legs. And there they are, those little devils. But thanks to the power of YouTube, it's the next day and we're pulling everything apart and giving it a quick sanding. Cody's checking those joints and making sure everything is perfectly flush. Now the assembly can be linked together again for the next steps. And Cody seems to magically vanish, so I'm left to my own devices. But no worries, because I'm not going to drop it. Nope, not at all. Told ya. The bottoms need adjustable feet in case whatever floor this table sits on in the future is uneven. And at first I try a Forstner bit, but it's just too wobbly. So a router and template is much safer, because the last thing I want to do right now is ram a bit off the edge of one of these legs. The pocket provides a place for the foot to go, that way you can't see it from the top side. And I will link any of the products that I use in the description below. And while you're there, it would really help the channel if you subscribed. We have awesome content in the works, and I promise you won't be let down. Or you can even go over to patreon.com/fortressfinewoodworks. I'm incredibly grateful for everyone that I have on my team. Thank you guys. The way we're connecting the legs to the tabletop is with C-channel, and the channel is connected to the legs with lag screws. The most important part is that the channels are mounted somewhat parallel to one another. That way they end up being set perpendicular to the tabletop, and one lag screw into each leg will be plenty for this purpose. Now the leg assembly itself can be attached to the table in a special way, and the two pieces of C-channel that connect the legs to the tabletop need to have a groove routed so that they're inset. This is pretty easily done just by marking out where they go and using a straight edge with a router to route out the channels. This is somewhat of a bravery test considering we've already put a lot of hours into the tabletop, and the last thing we want to do is screw up now. So now a quick blow with the hammer will mark where the lag screw is sticking up. Then we can just use a Forstner bit to drill out that material. Woodcraft by Saman actually did a great video about using threaded inserts versus tapping the wood itself, and it turns out you might not even need to use threaded inserts, but at the time of this filming, I didn't have a wood tap and I did have inserts, so I'm choosing to use those. In a previous video, we got the brass plating cut and it wasn't a fun process. But now we're all healed up so we can make templates to fit the brass to the leg assembly. It's just a lot easier to cut the paper rather than the brass to make sure everything fits perfect. So after cleaning up the edges of the brass, we can obviously use that template to mark where to cut. And I know this is probably hair-raising to see me freehanding this on the table saw, but it was a lot slower of a cut than you would think, and it was actually pretty safe for me. Honestly, a much safer way to do this would have just been making a sled for this little table saw, but I didn't, and this is what I chose. Either way, the brass is fitting like a glove, and I'm creating a small micro bevel with the sander so that I don't leave sharp exposed edges. This is actually a pretty enjoyable process. One thing I would suggest though is wearing some sort of gloves, because wherever that clear masking isn't on the brass, you can cause tarnishing with your fingerprints, and that'll just cause extra work later to sand off. I did mention in the previous video that this is a Hellman & Chang design, which is actually a $30,000 table, and that's why I titled that video as I did. In all honesty though, I didn't even price this table for a third of that. I priced it for $8,500, which realistically, I kinda screwed myself over. I highly underestimated how much work and material cost would go into this table. I guess all I can say is running a business is always a learning process. The first epoxy that I used with the brass did not adhere very well, but after a new test, JB Weld 5-minute epoxy has great adhesion, and luckily just rerouting the rabbet actually cuts the old epoxy off perfectly. I'm just adding file marks for the best adhesion possible, and we can start round 2 of the inlay work. And this time around, I'm feeling a lot more confident that the brass isn't just gonna fall off. And let's be honest, I probably lost a few nights of sleep over that one, but I guess everything's just another learning opportunity. While I'm sanding this end flush, I'm going to make sure that I'm keeping it square because any skewing could result in the breadboard being kinked. I'm also doing something that's more important than you'd probably think. I'm sanding a round over on just the ends of the inlay bands. This has a fairly simple reason. If and when the table contracts, we don't want that sharp edge of the brass exposed, ready to cut someone's hand. Conversely, we also want to round over the table edge in case it expands past the breadboard. The next step is to drill holes through the bottom side of each breadboard. This will house pegs that hold everything to the table. A quick auxiliary block just decreases tear out. Now we can hammer them on and mark the holes using that same bit. You can see that it marks the center perfectly, but we don't want to just drill exactly where that is, otherwise the pegs won't draw the breadboard tight. So I'm actually putting pressure towards the shoulder side of the tenon, that way it offsets the hole by about 1 millimeter. And to make things even a little bit more complicated, we can't just leave this a single hole, it actually has to be a slot so that the table can expand and contract. So by drilling 3 holes side by side, I can just file that into a groove. The most important part is that through the action of filing, I don't want to file it too loose because then the peg won't draw it tight. So I'm constantly checking with digital calipers to make sure I'm not screwing that part up. We do want to peg it in the center so it just gets a hole. The pegs themselves are going to be made with ebony since I have some left over from previous guitar builds, and it's extremely strong so it'll resist any loosening over time, since the grooves in the tenons could start wearing away at any softer pegs. A small taper on one end will just ease the process of driving them in when the time comes. So now I can get rid of that sharp edge on the table as well as any sharp edges on the brass. Pre-coloring any expansion ends now will just make sure they're black. The sequence of this glue up is actually rather important. I want to make sure that the pegs get glued in their holes, but I don't want the whole breadboard to be glued to the table. Only the center of the tenon will get glued since there will only be minimal expansion there. The rest has to be open for wood movement, otherwise it compromises this entire process. Now we don't want to just hammer the pegs in willy-nilly because we could blow them out the other side. So instead I seat them about 2/3 of the way, then use a long reach C-clamp to do the rest. These pegs will be a little bit tight to go in because of that offset hole. And we really need them all the way in for full strength, so if you can't get them, then I'll show you a method here in a second. I like to clean up the glue squeeze out before I flush cut, that way my saw doesn't get all gunked up. Thankfully, that side went perfect and we can start the other side. I learned quickly that I could just give the clamp a quick smack with the hammer to seat the peg. So the clamp keeps the peg from blowing out the other side, but the hammer adds that extra force needed. And there they are, just exposed on the bottom side. It's starting to look like an upside down table. But not for long because we need to get this thing ready for finish. We're doing a final sanding to 150 and the ends of the breadboards can finally be cut off. The final table length is 10 feet long, and every edge needs to be sanded to perfection, while Cody breaks any sharp edges on the leg base. One end needs one more quick flattening to be in plane with the table. Not much though, because most of that work was already done. The orbit sander leaves random scratch marks in the brass, and I personally don't think this looks good under a finish. So silly me, I'm actually straight sanding the brass now, but we're gonna have to just end up doing it later anyways, so it's pointless. The top edge of the table gets a micro bevel to make it easier on the user's arms. And yes, we can just route right over the brass. This next step is a fairly important one if you've seen some of my other table videos. I start by spraying all the dust out of the grain, then saturate the whole table with water. This process keeps the grain from raising later if any water were to infiltrate the finish. And we are going to be staining this, so get ready. After it's dry, I'm having Cody do the final sanding to 220. And while he cleans all the dust out of the grain, I'm mixing up some dark filler. I want the filler mixture to be pretty dark because the final stain color is going to be black. And this first round should be about the consistency of drywall mud. Just make sure your knife doesn't have burrs on it so that you don't create cross-grain scratches. I tend to go across the grain for the first coat and with the grain for the second, hoping that fills up the pores as much as possible. A quick sanding to 220 between the two coats helps free up any of that loose filler. The second coat is much thinner because by now the bigger pores have been filled and we need to fill the much smaller micro pores. And while that's drying, Cody can tape off the sides so we can officially stain the bottom. The stain we're using is Varathane's black gel stain, not to be confused with jet black, because jet black would actually cover up all of the grain and there would be no transparency left. And I know right now through the camera it looks like I'm just covering up all that beautiful walnut grain, but I promise after the solvent urethane finish goes on, all of that transparency will actually come back. And we don't want overlap marks on the sides, so that's why it was taped off to begin with. But now the bottom's done and something compels me to get this thing flipped over by myself, which I don't know why I'm willing to take a risk like this, but I guess I am. So the stupid reason why I decided to flip the table myself is because if I get a neighbor to help me, I'll be talking for the next 45 minutes.
Ain't nobody got time for that.
And she's right, I don't have time for that because I have to get this puppy sanded and stained before the weekend so that it can cure. Because failure to let the stain cure at this point could result in the finish not adhering correctly. So for the second time, I'm straight sanding the brass inlay so that it has a brushed look. And silly enough, I'm actually going to be doing it a third time, because I like to torture myself with repeatable, monotonous steps. To keep the brass from staining black, I'm using this archaic looking tool that I made to cut the purfling on my violin to now cut strips in tape. You can buy 1/4 inch wide tape, but I have this cutter, so I just cut it myself. I intentionally cut it less wide than the inlay, that way I can just use 2 layers to get a perfect fit. Now the sides and the top can get stained black, which seems horrifying because it looks like I'm just destroying the table. But realistically, this black tone will actually fit the customer's house and decor a lot better than the walnut will. And we all know black and white are just in style these days. Nonetheless though, this actually looks pretty freaking cool in the end, so just stick around. The legs and the sides of the table are going to have a satin finish urethane on them, while the top face of the table will have a high gloss urethane finish. But stick around till the end because this will actually present a problem for the breadboard joint. On the bottom side of the table, the Fortress emblem can be inlaid. I use part epoxy for strength and part CA glue for speed. And I like the matte black sheen on the emblem, and I don't want the urethane to change that sheen, so I'm going to cover it with tape. Now we can begin a rather complex and advanced finishing process. I would love to just be able to tell you that this is easy and DIY and anyone can do it, but we're dealing with different sheens and a lot of different processes during this entire finishing stage. The bottom of this table is the easiest part though, it just gets 2 coats of sealer. This Imron sealer happens to dry in a satin sheen, so I can just leave it as is. And you can see some of that clarity coming back into the wood. While that's flashing off, I'm prepping the brass by cleaning it with acetone, and I shortly realized that we left fingerprints, so I have to sand those back off. Then I can clean them again and spray them with sealer. The point of the sealer is to make sure that the brass doesn't tarnish in the future. And I'm doing 1 coat of sealer and 1 coat of top coat with a sanding in between, but you really only need just 1 coat to seal brass off. The brass screws that will hold the plating on also need to be sanded and top coated. Then the plating can get its final satin top coat. This is the same Imron satin that I'll use for the sides of the table and the leg assembly. Now we can responsibly flip the whole table with 2 people instead of 1. And I'm sure you're going to find this hard to believe, but it's a lot easier with 2 people. We can begin spraying the sides and the top with sealer. The top is going to get 6 coats of sealer today, and the sides are going to get 3. The legs will get 2 coats of sealer, then left to cure. We don't want a bunch of thick sealer to be in areas where we didn't fill the grain because it'll actually make the pores look a little weird. And when that sealer is dry, we actually test some blue tape on it because, yep, I feel like we need to sand this brass 1 more time. With 1 coat of sealer on the table, I could tell that the brass just wasn't perfect, so I sanded through the sealer and sanded the brass to perfection this time, followed by 5 more coats of sealer. After giving the finish 2 days to cure and shrink up, I can begin sanding. 320 grit will help get rid of any high spots, texture, or dust nibs that may be in the film at this point. The next seal coats won't adhere either if we don't add scratches to the finish. Because there is such a high risk of sanding through into the black stain, I'm actually just taking it about this far and not getting rid of all the texture. 1 more coat on the sides and 4 more subsequent coats on the top will add more build so that I can flatten it better later. And with 10 coats of sealer on and flashed off, we can get this into the other room because the other room stays much hotter and we can offer more airflow there. This will sit for about 1 week to shrink up. Meanwhile, we can get the legs sanded and vacuumed off. We want to make sure we don't leave any white specks in any of the pores, otherwise these could show up later. 1 last coat of satin top coat will get rid of that hazy look and bring back that beautiful color. And 1 week later, we can bring this 250-pound tabletop back out.
Oh my gosh! Oh gee!
The first step to do is flatten and sand the sides for that same satin top coat. Any overspray on the top will actually be taken care of in the next step, which I made this big sanding block with 320 grit, because this will actually get the table sanded flat, unlike any other small sander that would just conform to the waviness of the table, which you can actually see the low spots even despite me meticulously flattening this table earlier. Wood is just a natural thing with variations in grain hardness, and it's hard to get perfectly flat. I make sure to periodically clean off any specks of finish on the sandpaper. This is called corning, and that corning can potentially make really deep scratch marks in your table that you won't know are there until you get the top coat on. And now that everything is flat as glass, I can do a final sanding with the orbital and touch up any edges with a sanding pad. These 320 scratches are actually too coarse to just jump right to gloss top coat, because the top coat doesn't have enough build to fill in the scratches as well as give me enough thickness to buff. Then one last coat of sealer fills in those scratches, and 2 coats of gloss top coat can be sprayed in that same day to make sure that it burns in. So by now the gloss is almost perfect, but it has just a little bit of texture. And like I said before, this really is an advanced process because now we begin 2 more days of sanding and buffing. I used 400 grit to lightly do an initial flattening pass. Then it needs to be cleaned and the bevels can be flared in with 1000 grit. The next grits are going to be wet sanded, and I don't want that slurry to get in the joint between the table and the brass inlay, since we rounded those edges over for expansion. The reason why this process is a bit agonizing is because there's only 2 coats of gloss top coat and we can't burn through that, otherwise we'll actually get what's called ghosting or haloing. This happens when you burn through the top coat into the sealer, and you can actually see the different clarity that the sealer has versus the top coat. So after each grit, it's really important to clean off the table and make sure you haven't burned through, because if you have, then it's kind of pointless to continue. And you also need to clean the table to make sure that the previous grit doesn't contaminate the next grit. After 5,000, I can begin using cutting compound to start buffing the table. We want to make sure we get rid of all of these pigtails. So I actually end up switching from an orbital to a direct drive buffer. This creates a little bit more heat and friction so that it gets rid of the scratches easier. I'm just making sure I don't burn through. And now I've switched to a blue pad and I'm using polish, which will make this thing look like a freaking Ferrari. And you can see I'm extremely happy because I didn't burn through. And thankfully that finalizes that finish. When a project gets to this point, I can't help but feel just pure gratitude. There's just something bittersweet about finding myself in stressful situations and overcoming obstacles in a project. Because although the added stress no doubt adds some gray hairs here and there, crossing that line from problem to solution is what builds experience and character. The process of learning isn't always easy, and it shouldn't be. Because if I'm playing it safe, then I'm probably not growing. And if I'm not growing, then I'm usually not happy. So I guess what I'm getting at is stress equals happiness in its own far-fetched way. So since that happiness can be a rather hard thing to obtain, it's important to sit in it and have gratitude when it is there. That is until future Corey comes bearing bad news.
Unfortunately, I have some bad news. It's been about 3 months since we delivered the table, and it's now winter time. The clients have messaged me, and the finish is being pulled right off of the brass inlay because of the contracting table. And I know that there's no way that I could just do a quick fix. So there will be an update video on.
Well, the time has come to return the table to the shop, and thanks to everyone who helped me get it there. And like magic, here it is, and it's definitely showing a little bit of age and some nicks here and there. But one really good aspect is that the breadboard ends did let the table shrink like it was supposed to. The only problem is that the finish didn't crack straight when they were shifting by each other. Instead, it buckled and delaminated and even cracked off in areas. And I can't just take off the breadboards because remember, they're glued in the middle. So instead, I have a different solution in mind, and that starts with cutting the old finish off the brass. The most important step here is that the cut lines are exactly, perfectly straight. But I noticed something weird though. Cutting it with a blade like this, it actually makes the sides of the finish delaminate as well. So I'm using an old luthier trick to wick thin super glue underneath that finish and reconnect it to the table, which works really well.
So for this one, I'm going to try it a little bit differently. I noticed that last time when I cut with the knife, it kind of forced that finish up a little bit, and that's why it delaminated, and that's why I needed to use the super glue to fix it. For this one, I'm going to turn the blade sideways and try to cut it away. That is like the worst sound in the world, but it's working a lot better.
The way this works is that the blade is now cutting the material away and turning it into dust, as opposed to the way it was cutting before, where it just forces the finish apart. There are a few tiny spots just on the ends that I need to wick super glue into. I know it kind of all looks janky right now, but trust me, it looks perfect in the end. And you may be wondering why I'm not just refinishing the table altogether, and there's actually one specific reason. You can see over a year's time that the finish has shrunk and shown the grain. Now I have the opportunity to sand that flat again and add 2 more coats of top coat to make it perfect again. But I can't just slather finish onto the brass and expect it to be level with the tabletop because it will shrink over time. So instead I'm using an epoxy because that won't shrink. And any tiny spots that need to be touched up, I could just use a dark walnut marker, which I tested to make sure that it doesn't change colors underneath that epoxy. Because I've had this marker turn from brown to vibrant green underneath car clear coat.
All right, so I tested the epoxy over the marker, and after it's cured, there's no change whatsoever, so that's good. And I also tested the adhesion to brass, so let's see how well it stuck. Well, that was unfortunately not as good of adhesion as I need, so I'm gonna have to perform some other tests. I just don't know what tests to do yet.
Well, I decided to do 4 tests, 2 with 220 grit sanding and 2 with 80 grit. One of each of those has adhesion promoter sprayed on to see if that makes a difference. And the adhesion promoter didn't really do much of anything, but the 80 grit by itself is probably the best adhesion. So guess what I did? I sanded off all the old epoxy and put 80 grit scratches in the brass and started over. I'm using Superclear's tabletop epoxy for this process. It's designed beautifully for wood, so I'm really putting it to the test by putting it on this brass. But honestly, I must have a curse, because despite my tests, it just delaminated. Yep, it completely came off.
This table is just the gift that keeps on giving. So I performed 3 more tests, this time with water-based finishes, seeing if they actually get better adhesion. So one is a catalyzed finish, and then the other 2 are halcyon. I actually catalyzed the halcyon, which is not normal. So let's see if that actually worked or helped at all.
This first one is Envirothane 100 with a catalyst added. And the theory here is that the water-based product soaks into the brass pores and grooves a lot better than any other product would.
So this is actually great news. I'm getting really good adhesion with that catalyzed 100. The only thing I have to test now is if the epoxy will adhere to it. I'll be darned. I think I actually got adhesion. Yes! Finally got it! Good adhesion. I'm so happy, it just makes me want to cry.
Alright, so starting over once again, I'm putting that catalyzed 100 on first. Then I'm letting it cure for like 3 to 5 days while I work on other projects before I put the epoxy on. A few curing days later, I can begin flattening that epoxy relative to the tabletop. The best way to do this is with a razor blade that has tape on the outside edges so that it doesn't mar up the surface. If I were to go right to an orbital sander, I would never get it absolutely flat and there would always be a hump where the brass is. Now I can sand away the 2 top coat layers that are already on the table. The reason I have to do this is in order to put 2 coats back on, I have to get rid of the old coats, otherwise the finish would crack. So right now we're back down to the 12 layers of sealer that are underneath, and I'm spraying 2 more coats of the Imron top coat, which of course has to give me problems, right? Most likely the problem is I just needed to clean the table before I scuff sanded because there ended up being some sort of contaminants. But to solve this, I'm just spraying 3 coats and then I'm gonna make sure I sand off one of those coats. This flattening process is really important before I start buffing. If I don't get the surface perfectly flat, then it'll show up in the high gloss finish. So to make sure of this, I actually used 150 grit as my first pass. And I'm sure the automotive guys out there are like, what the heck is he doing? But remember, I had to take off at least 1 coat of finish to make sure it doesn't crack in the future. And then I just worked my way up the grits until I reached 5,000. Once again, I'm using the Meguiar's compound, but this one will prove to be a little bit harder since I used heavier grits at the beginning. And after starting a corner, I could see that there's still a lot of scratch marks, so I actually went back to sanding with the 1,000, 3,000, and 5,000 grits in order to get some of those scratch marks out. Then continued the polishing process hour after hour after hour.
I ran out of this Meguiar's compound, and it's cheap, but it's also very, very slow. So instead, I'm gonna try this Festool stuff, and hopefully it'll be a lot more efficient.
Festool at least makes it pretty simple by color coding their bottles and the sponges. The first one is a more aggressive cutting compound to get rid of those sanding scratches. And any of the rogue sanding scratches here and there can just be finessed by hand. By now I've been continuing this process for literal days, but the obsessive part of me just needs to make sure every spot is perfect. Now I can move on to the blue stage, which is a much finer polish. I talk more about these products and processes in an exclusive Patreon video. In fact, I post a lot of educational videos so that people can understand to the fullest extent why I do what I do. And thanks to the formal garden tier, we have planted trees all over the planet. So if you want to join, just go to patreon.com/FortressFineWoodworks.
Finally done polishing after several days. Here's a good tip. Don't start with 150 because it'll take you forever to sand out. And now I have to do the scariest part. I have to cut a straight line down each one of these joints so that there isn't finish separation in the future. Uh-oh.
Uh-oh is certainly right, because I'm about to do a very, very risky thing, and I've put literal weeks into repairing this table, and it's all under warranty, so I'm not getting paid.
How many yards of tape did I use in this project? Probably a whole lot.
This last step is the most crucial step out of anything I've done in this entire video. But by now I've learned that if I use the knife sideways, it will make a much cleaner cut. And what this is actually providing is a space in between the finish from the main table that expands and contracts and the brass that's on the breadboard end. That way it can't pull the finish off the brass in the future. Then I can tape off that cut line so that I can darken it with that same marker. But this alone doesn't provide any waterproofing, especially since I cut through the finish. So Rubio Monocoat Black is going to seal everything off to make sure no water gets in that joint.
I did it without scratching the table. Thankfully. So now that everything's buffed, I think I want to do one last thing, and that is a ceramic coating, because I want this high gloss table to stay high gloss for like 5,000 years. But first I need to clean it with naphtha. I know this looks like lighter fluid, which it is, but it's also naphtha. This finish is catalyzed so it can take the naphtha.
For the ceramic coating, I'm using Carbon Method. And by the way, I put any products in the description so that if you happen to want to use them, you can use those links. I'm personally doing 3 coats of the hard coat on the first day, and they're about 2 hours apart from each other. Then on a second day, I'm using 2 more coats of that hard coat just to make sure we have plenty on there. On the third day, I'm doing 3 final coats of the top coat to make sure everything is absolutely perfect. I know this seems like overkill since I used a catalyzed urethane underneath, but this will do a much better job at prolonging the life so that the finish doesn't have to take all of that brutal use. So after all of this, it's finally time to get the table back in its home. And again, thank you to the people who took time out of their day to help me get this in place. And to spin it around when of course we got it the wrong way.